Yes, I had my first piece in O, the Oprah magazine, recently, and I'm still retaining water. The book also comes in this handy-dandy audio book form, and it's narrated by the great Carol Spinney, who is Big Bird and Oscar. So if your eyes are tired and you don't feel like actually reading the book, he'll read it to you. Okay. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about what was for me an absolute labor of love. 5 years of doing reporting and deep research and interviewing and writing about the world's most influential television program, Sesame Street. And when I say the world, I mean it. There are some 140 versions of Sesame Street now across the globe, including most recently in Northern Ireland and a lot of other hotspots around the world. The idea of using television to try to teach preschoolers born at a dinner party in 1965 has indeed spread to 6 continents. And here in the United States, of course, it still rolls along, steaming toward its 40th anniversary season on PBS. One of the things that I wanted to talk about to kick things off tonight is the Washington angle to Sesame Street. The co-founders of Children's Television Workshop, the production nonprofit center that gave birth to Sesame Street, were Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette. They were friends in 1965 when they got together at Joan and Tim Cooney's apartment for dinner. Casual friends. Joan was working at Channel 13 in New York, WNET, the landmark public station, and she was creating documentaries and public service television for Channel 13. One of those documentaries was called A Chance at the Beginning, and it chronicled an extraordinary program in Harlem where educators and psychologists were giving intensive training and teaching to indigent preschool children, and the results were remarkable. These kids were learning so much so quickly that they were closing a gap that existed at the time between poor kids and kids who had better lives, middle-class kids. The gap was all about their readiness for school, how many skills they had and concepts they had down before they got to that first day of kindergarten or first grade. The kids in the ghetto were way behind, and therefore when they started public school, were behind the 8 ball, sadly. At the dinner party, Lloyd Morissette, who was an experimental psychologist by training, was then working for the Carnegie Corporation, asked a question out loud. You know, he had watched his then 3-year-old daughter, Sarah, just a few weeks before on a Sunday morning, sit cross-legged in front of the television around 6:30 in the morning, watching the test pattern. Just sitting there, watching the test pattern, waiting for the cartoons to come on at 7 o'clock. And he was startled by it. And he said, what is it about television that would make a child crawl out of bed at this early hour and just sit there and watch an Indian up on a field of geometric shapes? And some of you will remember that test pattern. So at this dinner party, he said, do you think television could do more than just educate? Do you think we could ever use it to teach, to promote the lives of little ones watching? And you know, at the time, children's television wasn't so hot. There were some bright spots, and certainly Captain Kangaroo was one of them, and Mr. Rogers was in his early years at that time. But for the most part, it was locally produced cartoon caravans and sort of junk. And that question asked at that dinner party was like a match that ignited Sesame Street. Just that one question. Joan and Lloyd helped to do some preliminary research to ask educators around the country and in Canada what they thought of the idea of a show for preschoolers that would try to teach how to count to 10 and how to recognize the shape and sounds of the alphabet letters. And Joan Gans Cooney came back from that trip encouraged by the responses from those educators and psychologists. And they, for the most part, they thought it was an idea worth trying. Well, if it was worth trying, if it was worth doing, it was worth doing well. And they set a pretty high funding target for the show. They knew that it would take a long time to develop, and they needed the money to do it well. And they began to look at what sources might be available. And they decided that they would approach the great philanthropies of this country, including the Carnegie Foundation and the Ford Foundation, but also approach the federal government, the U.S. Office of Education. And that's where the excerpt begins. And I want to share with you, right here in this city, when Joan and Lloyd took a trip to see if they could wrestle some money from the U.S. Office of Education, and specifically from a man named Harold Howe, who everyone called Doc. He was the commissioner of the USOE. Are we all ready? Okay. You can't discuss what transpired at the United States Office of Education on the final day of June 1967 without using that vivid, if slightly impolite noun, balls. The USOE's commissioner, Harold Howe II, had them. A civil servant, known from childhood as Doc, Howe slew a room full of bureaucratic dragons that day. He'd called the meeting only weeks after receiving a bulky parcel from his old friend Lloyd Morissette, a parcel that contained Joan Gans Cooney's feasibility study for Sesame Street, which Howe devoured. He was so intrigued by its argument and aims that he phoned to Morissette right away to ask that he come to Washington with that Cooney dame. Cooney recalled that Howe said to Morissette, "We don't know if we have the money to do this, I don't think, but come on down, and we'll sit around the table with the department people, the research people, the preschool education people." Doc Howe was a man of action, conviction, and concern for his fellow man, traits seemingly passed genetically. Born in Hartford, Connecticut in 1918, he was the son of the Reverend Arthur Howe, a Dartmouth College professor who had become president of Hampton Institute in Virginia, now Hampton University. Reverend Howe's father-in-law, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, had been a Union general who commanded black troops in the Civil War. He later founded Hampton as a trade school for freed slaves. Doc spent a part of his upbringing as a young white man on that traditionally black campus, the rest of it near Dartmouth's campus in Hanover, New Hampshire. A northern New Englander by transplantation, he hiked in New Hampshire's mountains, fished for trout, and skated on local ponds. At just a shade taller than 6 feet, with his sinewy build and springy legs, he never stood still for too long in one place. A blur on the ice rink, the left-handed winger skated with the varsity at Yale. He left New Haven in 1940 with a history degree and briefly taught at a private school. During and after World War II, he skippered a minesweeper in the Pacific.